Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwen Faulconer Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with award-winning author and historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. Here now on Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the stories we discover. From the Oklahomans One, John J. Dwyer, tell me this story.
Well, Gwen, the towering story of mid-19th century Indian Territory remains the tenacious Christian missionary efforts engineered by Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, Moravians, Catholics, and others. As you know, we chronicle this epic work that vastly changed the history of Oklahoma and the American West in Volume 1, as you said, of our two-book Oklahoma history set, The Oklahomans, the story of Oklahoma and its people. In fact, one entire chapter entitled The Cross of Christ is devoted to it, and parts of several others. So, early Christian missionary work, how exciting does that sound? It was very exciting, especially to the people involved. The 5 great Indian republics that we traditionally were referred to as the 5 civilized tribes were the most advanced among Native Americans in embracing the social practices, religion, education, and commercial pursuits of America and Western Christian civilization. Though some members of these groups became Christians prior to their removal from the American Southeast to Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, on the trails of tears, many others did not, particularly among the major Muskogean tribes of the Creeks and Seminoles. The cataclysmic experience of the Trails of Tears left these weary, heartsick tribes in an unprecedented position. They'd suffered violent abuse and been forced to move across the country, the continent, from their ancestral homes by a people who had only lately arrived in the natives' own lands. Now they faced dangerous challenges in the new country they'd been forced to embrace. All these events came at the hands of a people who claimed and even spread the Christian faith. Resistance, even hostility, rose against that people and its religion, particularly amongst the Creeks. Sacred fires, magic medicines, stomp dances, and powwows occurred across the nations, as Indian Territory was often called. Many in the tribes saw no reason to embrace Christianity after the way its professed adherents had treated them. Nothing less than the spiritual destiny of the Indian republics, whether they would develop as Christian or non-Christian peoples, hung in the balance. Into this maelstrom of emotion, confusion, bitterness, and uncertainty rode those Christian missionaries. They emerged as one of the most courageous groups in Oklahoma history. Scores of white missionary families, as well as single male and female missionaries, carved an indelible imprint on the Indian republics and the history of the territory and state. Large numbers of Christian natives and African Americans took up the banners of this crusade. Perhaps Joseph's famous words at the end of the epic biblical book of Genesis about man meaning something for evil, but God meaning it for good, had an application here. Multitudes of Choctaws, Seminoles, Creeks, Cherokees, and Chickasaws, battered and bereft, turned finally to Christ for salvation from both earthly and heavenly horrors. Missionaries, some of whom have achieved legendary status and fame, though that was not their intent, gave their time, talent, resources, and sometimes their lives to reach the natives of the Oklahoma country with the Christian gospel. They were predominantly Baptists or Presbyterians, but a healthy number were Methodists and Methodist Episcopalians or Congregationalists. Some were Moravians or Catholics, and many later ones were Mennonites. Some of the missionaries were men, but at least a couple hundred of them were women, many of whom were single. They preached the gospel, started schools, and taught in them, and served as doctors, nurses, counselors, and trainers in various vocations. They translated the Bible and other literature into indigenous languages, fixed meals, advised the tribes on matters of law, defended them against the dangers of alcoholic beverages, dispensed precious medicines, and stood with them before American territorial courts and law enforcement officers. In any generation, a young, white, single female departing an educated and somewhat affluent home in New England, a traditional lighthouse of Western civilization, for a land populated by a different race and culture of people, half a continent and 2,000 miles away, would represent a notable undertaking. For 30-year-old Vermont native Jerusha Swain in mid-19th century America, it stood as nothing less than audacious, not to mention dangerous and uncertain by nearly every human measurement. Yet, near the end of her long and valiant service, Jerusha Swain declared, "I have become so much assimilated to the people that I feel more like a Cherokee than anything else. I hardly know how I can act in civilized society." Anne Eliza Wooster Robertson, meanwhile, some of whose relatives we've discussed in other Oklahoma Gold programs, she would gain renown as the famed missionary to the Creek, one of the greatest of all American Christ-bearers to its native peoples. She would one day translate the entire New Testament into the Muskogee Creek language. Worcester University would bestow upon her the first honorary doctorate ever awarded to a woman in the United States. Somehow I missed that in my Oklahoma history studies, Gwen. In summary, unlike some missionaries in other settings, those of early Indian Territory respected, loved, and served America's indigenous peoples whose forefathers themselves had somewhere along the way come to modern-day Oklahoma. Most of these missionaries have been forgotten, but one of the blessings of histories is that they can help remedy such injustices. After the break, we'll explore the great feats of early Indian Territory natives themselves to extend the banners of Christ across their domains and bless all who came under their influence.
John J. Dwyer, why have you chosen this topic?
Well, a number of reasons. First of all, it's incredible history, incredibly important history. Those of us that even have studied some history would think of, Oklahoma, Indian Territory before that was, a barren wilderness for time immemorial. Some tribes came here, and then some others were forced here on the Trails of Tears. White-dominated American settlement and pioneers eventually tied it over and took over. Then it eventually became a state. We don't realize what was really at stake back at the beginning of real settlement. And we see significant settlement beginning in Oklahoma not until the 1800s. And just what was up for grabs, what was at stake. These tribes had come from other areas. We talk about in Volume 1, the second Trail of Tears, that were the Plains tribes coming from the north and the west, sometimes forced to do so. And as an example, the Choctaw were so brokenhearted that they're at having to come west. Their principal chief, David Folsom, pleaded with the white Christian missionaries such as Samuel Worcester to come west with them to help galvanize them, to pick up their spirits and give them encouragement.
Weary, heartsick tribes. The golden nugget when we return. Now that's Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through points of view we've never considered. John J. Dwyer, one of the things I really appreciate about Oklahoma Gold is that you present the perspective of people we've never heard from. Tell us more.
Well, as an example, we're talking about early, largely in the beginning, white Christian missionary efforts in Indian Territory. So I think, well, gosh, wait a minute, weren't those the people that forced the natives to come here in the first place? Well, we forget that Christian clergymen and women like Samuel Worcester was thrown in prison for defending the Cherokees against losing their land back in Georgia against federal officers like Andrew Jackson. So no race, no people, no social group is monolithic. Individuals have their own purposes for doing what seems best to them for the good of the people they care about. And that's a guiding barometer for us in our pursuit of Oklahoma history.
The people they care about. And I've never given single women missionaries a consideration before. What a sacrifice.
Some of the greatest in American history were those that came west alone, suffered, and in some cases died to bring the gospel of Christ to a people they'd never even seen before. Well, these mission efforts to Indian Territory began as early as 1820, over 2 centuries ago. From the beginning, the work of Christ among the Indian nations proved challenging and dangerous. Some missionaries died even before reaching the territory. Once there for decades, missionaries died of disease, found themselves caught in the crossfire of such wars as the bloody one between the Osages and the Cherokees, the very people they're trying to reach. And they faced hostility from other individuals and groups. For instance, initially embittered at what they considered the church's collusion in regard to the native removal from the southeast, the Creeks stood amongst the most determined opponents of Christianity and its representatives. Conservative Creeks championed laws prohibiting white Christian missionaries from even setting foot on tribal land. They persecuted those who did. Also, they delivered brutal punishment, including 50 lashes with a bullwhip, to natives and blacks who prayed or worshiped on Creek land. Gradually and inexorably, however, through patience, suffering, and nonviolent peacemaking, Christian Creeks began to impact their own tribe. They traveled to worship on other tribes' lands when forced to, or endured punishment and persecution for worshiping in their home country. Finally, they won over the Great McIntosh family. That's a name that resounds through Oklahoma history. The McIntoshes, one of our counties is named after them. The McIntoshes, like the Apostle Paul prior to his first century conversion, had been fervent opponents of the Christian faith and its ministers. The conversion of the McIntoshes turned the tide toward Christianity among the Creeks. 3 of martyred Creek Chief William McIntosh's sons became Baptist ministers. Subsequently, despite lingering hostility from some Creek traditionalists, white Baptist missionaries H.P. Buckner and Joseph S. Murrow gained renown for their tireless and selfless work over decades of time among the Creeks. Joseph Murrow, who wrote one of the great early Oklahoma histories, labored among them, the Creeks, the Seminoles, and the Choctaws, for 72 years, never wavering from his declaration in the first sermon he ever preached to the Creeks, "I seek not yours, but you." The Presbyterian missionaries leading of revered Seminole chief John Jumper to faith in Christ cast a similarly profound influence on that tribe. The Seminoles, too, had resisted Christianity due partly to their brutal subjugation by the United States, a supposed Christian nation, during the Seminole Wars back in Florida. We talk about that in Volume 1 of the Oklahomans. Soon, Presbyterian and then Baptist churches multiplied through Seminole lands and do so to this day. It also enhanced the quality of their lives through the 1840s and 1850s in Indian Territory, even though an increasing vulnerability to liquor, which whites had introduced to them, cast a shadow over them. Even here, though, Christian missionaries labored in service to the tribes, standing against the consumption of alcoholic spirits, warning about the destruction that it brought to so many lives, red, white, and black alike, and giving exhortation to them about the powerful Christian lives they could have when abstaining from it. Epaphras Chapman and his bold Presbyterian contingent established the first Christian church in the territory, Union Mission, in the Osage country, and with it, present-day Oklahomans' first school. Union Mission and its school would eventually minister to hundreds of children, including Osages, Creeks, and members of other tribes. Indeed, Christian missionary efforts spawned the establishment of dozens of schools across the territory that delivered to Native young people the unsurpassed educational treasures of Western civilization, beginning with reading and writing English and learning mathematics. Schools, in fact, proved to be an integral component of most Indian Territory mission efforts. In the end, Two of the historic contributions of Christian missionaries in the territory to the tribes they served were helping to stabilize and strengthen them after their trails of tears and equipping them to work, produce, and prosper in their new Western land. The 5 Indian republics more than shouldered their share of the load on the educational front. They brilliantly channeled most of the funds paid for their lands back east to launching and maintaining other schools. In addition, they each elected a commissioner of education to supervise these activities and provide the selection, certification, and training of teachers. These tribes generally provided kindergarten through grammar school instruction, as well as special education tracks for those with physical disabilities, quality boarding schools for students who advanced to higher grades, and financial support for exceptional students who qualified for college attendance back east. Though all 5 so-called civilized tribes committed precious resources to educating their youth, the Cherokees and Choctaws left particularly notable legacies in that regard. And as we close, do you want a golden nugget from this story, Gwen? When slaves Wallace and Minerva Willis traveled the Choctaw Trail of Tears from either Mississippi or Alabama in the early 1830s with their Choctaw owner, Brett Willis, no one knew that one of the most brilliant song composers in American history was moving to the future state of Oklahoma. A natural-born song composer, singer, and storyteller who mesmerized little children and adults alike, and whose songs would one day be sung before Queen Victoria herself, one of history's greatest spirituals came to him as he worked the fields along Red River and imagined it as the old Jordan, heaven's promised land on the other side. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
Now that's Oklahoma Gold.